I'll just open in prayer. That's okay. Pray, Lord, for the talk that I'm about to do. Pray for this evening. I pray that we can all approach this talk with an open mind as to what you're wanting to tell us, Lord. As we go through your words, if you can make revelations to us of what your word means. As we address some very difficult issues, I just pray your hand be upon me and to keep everyone, like I say, open-minded and for good approach to this message. I'll just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so this is quite a difficult talk, if I'm being honest, because I'm probably going to offend people here. Maybe that's why we're small in number, but I think that's quite nice, actually, for this particular thing. So I feel very happy, actually, the number of people, so that's very good. Okay, so the aim of this talk is I'm going to present a case for how the church has been infiltrated by pagan traditions. I'm going to show you how these traditions are still present in the church today. It's very likely that people here probably engage in some of these. I'm going to make a case for why, obviously, we should avoid these traditions, and this is the area that we're going to be looking at today. And the more I think I talk about it and the background I give on it, the more you're probably going to recognize it in the church today. So this talk will be split into two parts. I'm going to talk in the first part to really lay a basis. I'm going to go into show you how Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17, in my view, refers to the Catholic Church. And this is really to prove the pagan roots of the Catholic Church, which I believe to be the main form of false religion in the world. This then gives a really good basis for the next part, when we're going to walk through the letter to the Church at Pergamos, which, when we get into it, I believe represents a time period where the church mixed in with the world and took on a lot of these Catholic, these pagan traditions. And this should comprehensively show how that the church has been infiltrated by Babylonian paganism. And then I'm going to highlight two major errors. I could have gone into a lot more, but I highlighted two. I felt particularly led to go into these two that the church still engages in today. For this talk, I did quite a lot of research into Babylon, Mystery Babylon, and a lot of church history. And particularly two works that I used were the Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, you might have heard of this, and then Babylon, Mystery Religion by Ralph Edward Woodrow. A lot of the information I've taken, I've summarized what they've said. So if you want to look into further what I've said, or if you don't believe me, those two do a much better job of explaining it than I do, because I've condensed it quite a lot. But I very much recommend reading those two books. I think they belong in any Christian library, absolutely. So we'll go into the first part, then we'll have a little break, and we'll do the second part. This first part is going to be a bit shorter. I think the last part is a bit longer, but it's definitely much more interesting, in my point of view. So we're going to look at how Rome adopted this Babylonian paganism. So, as I said, I'm going to have a look at the argument that Mystery Babylon, Revelation 17, refers to the Catholic Church. And to do this, I'm going to go into the history of Babylonian paganism. Then I'm going to explain how the church in Rome has adopted these practices through church history. And then I'm going to walk through Revelation 17, only verses 1 through 7, to pinpoint what we understand Mystery Babylon and the link to the Catholic Church that we see, and the reasons that I believe that is Mystery Babylon, therefore hopefully proving that there is a Babylonian paganistic root in the Catholic Church still present today. So we need to understand this concept of two Babylons. So Hislop makes this distinction in his book, The Two Babylons, between this idea of what the old and new Babylon is. We see both of these in the Bible. Obviously, we've seen the old Babylon, particularly if you look at Daniel, which is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We see prophecies of these being destroyed in Isaiah and Jeremiah. However, despite the old Babylonian religion being destroyed, the mystery religion that we see has continued through successive empires that have conquered Babylon. We've also seen a big mixing in the Middle East between lots of religions, lots of different ideas being taken. So this has really come to a head with the Roman Empire that took on a lot of these traditions, which is then, I suppose, merged into the Catholic Church, what we see today. And it's really important that we understand that, obviously, we're going to look into this, but the origins of Babylon, we're going to see that this is the source of all idolatry and opposition to God, and that is today manifest in the Catholic Church. So we'll have a look at the origins of Babylon. We'll have a look at the origins of Babylon. So we see the origins of Babylon when we look at the construction of the Tower of Babel, particularly in the early part of Genesis 11. Now, this is led by a man named Nimrod. Nimrod becomes a really important figure that I'll be getting into. But you see Nimrod being talked about in Genesis 10, verse 8 and 9. And the key ideas that we can take from these verses, not a lot is spoken of Nimrod, but there is a lot in Babylonian mythology about Nimrod. His name means he rebelled. Firstly, so that should give you some indication of what he's about. And then it's understood here in verse 9, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. It says there, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And here the word for before is often used to mean against. Many people would argue it's almost a mistranslation. It shouldn't mean before, it should mean against. It's an argument made by theologians. So we see in Nimrod almost the first active major opposition to God's order, to God as such. Obviously, people have sinned before, but in Nimrod, with the construction of the Tower of Babel, many people make the argument it's almost like the first religion, because obviously the Tower of Babel was an attempt to reach God, and that is effectively what religion is. It's man's attempt to almost reach God as such with their standard. So like I say, it's understood that Nimrod went on to become the first king of the city of Babylon. There are many different understandings, but if you read the two Babylons, Alexander Hislop gets into this idea that it's Cush that actually founded Babylon, and Nimrod that went on to become the first king. And in Babylonian mythology, Nimrod is then proclaimed as a god, or this godlike figure who they worship through the ages. And he forms part of this Babylonian trinity. This includes Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. You may recognize the name Tammuz, particularly from, I believe, Ezekiel he's mentioned. I think in some of either Kings or Samuel he's mentioned. Semiramis was Nimrod's wife, and Tammuz was his son. And there's a really key story that surrounds the death of Nimrod, particularly. Hopefully in a minute you'll start to see the relevance to today. So when Nimrod died, Semiramis claims that Nimrod was resurrected as the sun god, and then he went on to inseminate her, and that's how then she gave birth to Tammuz. She then obviously claimed that Tammuz was therefore reincarnated version of Nimrod, and was therefore divine. Obviously, this is where we get the idea of Tammuz being the sun god, and subsequent gods which are replaced by Tammuz end up being the sun god. This is a very important concept of understanding. And then, from this, Semiramis claimed that she saw an evergreen tree grow from the dead stump, which symbolizes Nimrod's new life. To celebrate this, gifts would be left under a tree in and around the time of the winter solstice, and this would have been around the time of the 25th of December, which is dedicated to Tammuz, which they do these things. This probably sounds quite familiar in terms of what things that Christians will be doing. This then started the Babylonian religion of worshipping Tammuz, the sun. Semiramis was also worshipped, and this is what started a popular religious concept we see, and we will see throughout the Middle East, of mother and child worship. So we have a picture here of Semiramis with Tammuz. Again, if you look at particular Catholic imagery, I've worked in a Catholic school myself, you see this image or something very, very similar to this almost everywhere, okay? It's really important we have an understanding of where that concept has come from. Now, this religious system was then spread around the world, and we see the mother and child worship in many pagan religions. So it's not just the simple fact that it just came from Babylon and it's just a sort of a one-off from there, but rather it has found itself in almost or most of these pagan religions. I would say most likely due to the inspiration of Satan working in these pagan religions. See, that's a key concept. You can see here, you've got Asia, you've got Egypt, Greece. Like I say, in Alexander Hislop's book, The Two Babylons, he goes into very much all the detail where these all originate. So again, if you want more details of this, I'd very much encourage reading his book. We're going to have Japan. And the last couple being very significant, in Rome you had Venus and Cupid, which eventually became, what we understand, obviously Mary and Jesus. So this mother and child worship continued all the way through and got brought into Christianity. So obviously with the Roman Empire, this is where obviously the last two come into. But with the Roman Empire, being one of the biggest empires at the time, they took on many traditions and gods of the region that the Roman Empire ruled over, and they brought them into Roman paganism. And then when the Roman Empire became Christianized at the start of the 4th century of Emperor Constantine, he then kept many of those pagan ideas that we see in pagan Rome and brought them into Christianity. I'm going to talk a lot about his conversion, but just to give you, I suppose, an idea beforehand, so we're going to see how his conversion was almost entirely politically motivated and served the purposes that he wanted. It wasn't a true conversion. Many Catholics or people of that persuasion are going to say that Constantine's conversion was good for the world. I'd argue the total opposite. So, once the Roman Empire then adopted Christianity, it is eventually merged into the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the religion which is spread around the world. It's the biggest religion globally at the moment, and it is only growing. And this is the mystery religion that we see in Revelation 17 as Mystery Babylon. And as we walk through Revelation 17, I'm going to make that case. So, before I dive into Revelation 17, we've got to understand the context of Revelation. If anyone obviously doesn't know, in chapter 1, we see the things that John saw, the visions he saw. We see chapter 2 and chapter 3, the things that are, which are the 7 churches. However, there is a prophetic element to that, which I'm going to get into. We then see chapters 4 to 22, which are the things that will take place after this. We see between chapters 6 and 18, we see a description of what's going to happen in the Great Tribulations. We've got the 7 bowls, etc. And chapter 17 describes the woman then riding the beast. And this is the description of the religious and political world system that's going to be active in the tribulation. And we're going to see the links to Rome with that. So, it's only 7 verses we'll walk through, but hopefully we'll be able to identify the key points that link this to Rome. So, reading from Revelation 17:1. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked to me with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup, full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication." You'll see the important bit. And on her head a name was written, "Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the abominations of the earth." I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and then the 10 horns. Then John goes on to explain much of, obviously, the behaviour that both the woman riding the beast, what they do, and then chapter 18 gets into their destruction. However, we're going to walk through this, and we're going to see, hopefully, how the distinction between the old Babylon and new Babylon, and how this new Babylon is Rome. So the first thing to note, obviously, this woman obviously is a great harlot, and harlotry is often represented, or often represents apostasy. We see Jeremiah, Hosea. Remember, many times Israel are told they're playing the part of the harlots. They are playing the harlots. In Hosea, he's instructed to marry like a prostitute. So that idea is almost, so it's not just idolatry as such, but more very much apostasy, which then we've got quite a good candidate for an apostate church, or so-called church. We see fornication, so the harlot is making the kings of the earth commit fornication. Again, fornication, whenever it talks about Israel committing fornication, it's often when they're led astray into these false religions, which are heavily linked to this mystery religion of Babylon throughout the Old Testament. And then so we can see the link between, obviously, Babylon and idolatry. And it says, so the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So it's going to be the case that this is the whole world is going to be involved. It's been believed by many theologians that during the time of tribulation there will be one global religion. Whether it's Catholicism in its current form or something later, we'll have to see, but I think the roots are going to be in Roman Catholicism. And we're not too far away from the end times, in my opinion. And we can already see the Catholic Church, as of 2025, it's believed, has gone past the barrier of 1.4 billion people on the planet. So it's by far the biggest religion. And this number's rising as well. There's much talk about a Christian revival going on right now. There are only really 2 churches that are growing, and that's hyper-charismatic and Catholic, or branches of Catholicism. So when people are talking about things like Bibles being bought and things like that, I don't really hold too much hope, because it's those 2 churches that are growing, and true believers are going to get, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there's going to be less and less of us as we approach the end times. So we carried on, again, so this is where John sees a woman, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. So a woman can represent many things in the Bible. Typically we see idolatry, so Revelation 2:20, which actually relates to the church of Thyatira, which I believe represents the Catholic Church, talks about Jezebel. In Matthew 13:33, again, that's a woman with the leaven who hides the leaven. Again, another representative of something that happens in the church involving a woman, which is a form of idolatry. But I've talked about Matthew 13 a few times. There's not quite enough time to dive into today. Can represent Israel. We've seen Revelation 12. And then it can also represent the church. So, again, we're talked as being the bride of Christ, for example. And obviously I'd make the case, and many theologians make the case, that this woman is going to represent an idolatrous or apostate church. It's going to combine, it's obviously not going to be Israel, but rather it's most likely a church in some way that is involved in idolatry. Again, this would make the Catholic Church quite a good candidate for this. We then see this idea in verse 3 of it has 7 heads. We get an interpretation from verse 9, a couple of verses on, or a few verses on, that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Again, I'm unsure of this, but just so you're made aware, many commentators suggest that this references or refers to the 7 hills or mountains of Rome, since the word for mountains can often mean hill. So Rome was obviously formed by 7 hills, and this idea that many people might interpret this to be like a pope figure who obviously sits in Rome on those 7 hills, for example. I'm unsure about that interpretation, but it's there if you want to consider it. And then, like I say, obviously having 7 heads and 10 horns. And we see this imagery in Daniel 7. We'll go through this section before we get into Daniel 7. It's really important to note because this reference to the 10 horns becomes our link then between what is happening here in the tribulation and then the image in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, linking them all to the end times. It's 10 horns. So it becomes quite important. So as we continue in verse 4, so the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. Again, this is another potential link to Rome. Historically, Roman emperors wore purple. That was their national representation of their colour as such. And the purple and scarlet is really fascinating because these are actually liturgical colours of the Catholic Church. You'll often see bishops being dressed in purple, and it's cardinals who are just under the Pope. They tend to wear scarlet. So we see, hopefully, we can start to see a clear link between Rome, all the language used about Rome, the language used about the Catholic Church, and where they come together. And obviously, this woman is adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. So this just signifies wealth. And the Catholic Church is estimated to have a wealth value between 10 billion and 15 billion total. So I'm not sure, I'm not an economist, but that's quite a lot. And I imagine that will just keep growing as well. Then we have the key here, so Mystery Babylon the Great. So this term, obviously, Mystery Babylon. If I'm right about what has been said before, about the links to Catholicism, here it's almost revealing that mystery that is the fact that the Catholic Church is rooted in Babylonian paganism. Then we see from verse 6, so I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. This wouldn't be the first time the Catholic Church has historically persecuted other denominations. So this is obviously alluding to the fact that Catholic Church will persecute the saints during the tribulation. But again, we've seen it before, obviously medieval inquisitions, Spanish and Roman inquisitions. And then, with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in this country, we've seen, even for daring to make copies of the Bible, these people have been persecuted, killed, etc. Okay? So the Catholic Church, this isn't a new thing for them to do. And then we get into verse 7, which I find one of the more interesting parts of this. So, obviously, I will tell you the mystery of the woman. And obviously, mystery, there are several mysteries we see throughout the Bible. And one of them is the mystery of the woman, or the mystery of Babylon exactly. And this pertains to, obviously, a hidden truth, which is then revealed. And I think a really important mystery part of this is the fact that today, many people will look at the Catholic Church as simply a misguided church where there are people that are saved. But we really need to understand that actually not only is the Catholic Church apostate, but it is the face of false religion in the world today, which is something that's not really said. But when you have that understanding of that, then a lot of their behaviours, a lot of their idolatry makes a lot more sense, as opposed to them just being misguided. And then we see here, obviously, we had the 7 heads and then the 10 horns. And we see this in Daniel 7. So this is where we're going to go to next. So obviously, I want to prove the link between Mystery Babylon to Rome. I'm going to go through Daniel 7, Daniel 2. And what we're going to see in Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, we're going to see effectively how this Mystery Babylon as the beast, Daniel 2 particularly gives a really good origin of where exactly this comes from, where it was born out. Because if anyone's compared Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 side by side, you see 4 kingdoms laid out in Daniel 7, in Daniel's vision. But you see 5 kingdoms laid out in Daniel 2. in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, which makes for an interesting understanding of that final kingdom in Daniel 7, because according to Daniel 2, that is split into two parts. And that final part is going to be in the end times. So it's really interesting. We've got to understand where that root comes from, and I'll get into the interpretations of that. And my belief is that there's definitely, this is the Catholic Church, and there's a very strong evidence to suggest that there are Roman roots in whatever that final beast is, whatever that final empire is. So we've got an image here. So this is really all I'm going to be going through. I'm going to provide scriptures for this image. So in Daniel 2, if you're familiar, hopefully you are, with these passages, quite famously, Daniel 2 has that statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And in Daniel 7, we see the four beasts. And they line up quite well because they're talking about the similar things, except for when you get to Rome at the very bottom, how that is split into two parts. And we're just going to explore that and work our way through those. So as we look at Daniel 7, so Daniel has had a dream and a vision of four beasts, and these represent four kingdoms, so we know from verse 17. And Daniel 7:3-7 outlines these. So we're going to see the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and then, well, it says Rome or Antichrist. He only really describes an Antichrist system at the end, but we're going to see how that relates to Rome when we look at Daniel 2. So, as we see here, so from verse 4, so the first is like a lion and an eagle's wings. We're going to get into why the lion and the eagle's wings means Babylon. We'll explain in a minute. We have the first 5. Another beast was like a bear, so that's the Persian. There's another like a leopard, that's the Greek. And then the fourth beast. This isn't described but as an animal at all. This is just called a beast. And really importantly, we see at the bottom here, and it's different from all the other beasts that were, and it had 10 horns. So again, that relates it back to Revelation 17. So working our way through this, obviously we see the first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. So this is representative of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So if anyone's been to the British Museum, you may have seen these lions with wings. That's an Assyrian image, but that was very, very common at that time. So Babylon was quite close proximity to Assyria, and they used similar imagery. And Nebuchadnezzar particularly, I believe, had winged lions that guarded the gates of the royal palaces in Babylon. That's why that represents Babylon. The second beast, like a bear, is raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So this represents the Medo-Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire. So the reason it's raised up on one side is because the Persians were so much stronger than the Medes. This relates to the fact that, I believe it was Cyrus, who was actually half Mede, half Persian, who managed to combine the two empires. And then the 3 ribs in its mouth were 3 empires they destroyed. Obviously, the Persians, we know from Daniel, conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It conquered the Median, which is where the Medes come from. So it was a vassal kingdom, but it revolted, and they managed to suppress it. And then the Lydian Empire. So these are the 3 ribs. It's represented as the ribs between its teeth. We then see the leopard, and on its back had 4 wings of a bird, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So obviously this represents the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. The leopard represents how quickly he conquered much of the known world. His empire spanning, as you think, from Greece, but as far east. Eventually, I believe he reached close to India. And then the 4 heads represent the 4 generals who divided the kingdom after Alexander's death. So Alexander died in his early 30s and divided his kingdom between 4 generals, and they provided 4 Hellenistic empires that came after. So it wasn't exactly the Greek Empire anymore, but simply 4 Hellenistic empires. We then gets interesting because it gets into this final beast. And there's no real indicators that this relates to Rome as such, but we're going to have a look at Daniel 2 to see how it does. And obviously we see the link with 10 horns, and obviously this is a reference in Revelation 17. So you can clearly see how this would be somewhat of an antichrist system, as it's the same reference used in Revelation 17. But then when we examine these empires, when we look at Daniel 2, we're going to see the link with Rome. So Daniel 2, again, that go through 4 kingdoms, Daniel 7 goes through the 4 kingdoms, obviously, but Daniel 2 is going to be slightly different, as Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that contains 5 kingdoms, but the last one is obviously split into 2. And the key difference being in the last one. So again, same again. So when we look at Daniel 2, the head of gold, so this is the statue that we're talking about from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The head was fine gold, represents the Babylonian. His chest and arms of silver, which represents the Persian. Its belly and thighs of bronze, which represents the Greek. Its legs of iron, which is the Roman. And then its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, which becomes really, really interesting, and it's probably the most controversial part of this chapter in Daniel, the Revive. So we see this image here. It's also really important to note that many theologians will interpret this to mean the times of the Gentiles. So Luke 21:24 references the time of the Gentiles. I'm going to get into different interpretations about this final empire, but my view is that this empire, or these 5 empires, take us from that time Daniel's talking about until the millennium, which means there can't be any gaps, in my opinion. Which means after the Roman Empire, let's just say this. So many theologians will say that there's a big gap between the Roman Empire and then that Antichrist empire. However, I'm going to argue, I believe that there isn't, which means we've got to think of an empire, or we've got to work out what that revived Roman Empire is, as it's got to be an empire that began, when the Roman Empire finished and lasts until Christ's millennial kingdom. Okay? There can't be a gap there, in my opinion. So we give a good interpretation here from Daniel. So he says to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel goes in and interprets his dream. He says, "You are his head of gold." So obviously the first empire is the Babylonian one. After him, see one inferior arose, which was the Persian Empire. And it was Cyrus the Great invaded Babylon in 539 BCE. So again, we see that in the book of Daniel. We then see another one, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. So that's much of the known world at that time. And this is the Greek Empire. So Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 330 BCE. We then have the fourth kingdom, shall be as strong as iron. So this fourth kingdom, or fourth empire, is the Roman Empire. And this pretty much took over the place that Greece had. So the Roman Empire, they conquered mainland Greece and Macedon in 146 BC. And the Hellenistic period, so since Alexander's death, obviously, we had the 4 empires sort of split up. So you didn't, in fact, have a Greek empire, but again, it was more like a Hellenistic influence over the world. This even spread its way to Egypt, for example. But this was officially finished with the War of Actium in 32 BC to 30 BC. So people say that the Hellenistic period ended during the Roman Civil War after Caesar's death. So when Julius Caesar died, there was a big power struggle between those who could potentially take over, and Augustus Octavian, came through as the victor over Mark Antony. You might know like Mark Antony and Cleopatra from Shakespeare. It doesn't quite work out, their love story like that. But eventually, when Cleopatra and Mark Antony eventually commit suicide, that was basically the end of the Civil War, which pretty much marked the end of the Hellenistic period and saw the Roman dominance, particularly with empires, because Octavian was considered to be the first Roman emperor to establish full power, cement his power, and the Roman Empire only grew from there. So then we get into the really controversial part of this passage. So, whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of the potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. So there are many different interpretations of who the feet and the toes represent. There are also many different interpretations as what the iron and the clay represent as well. You know, we obviously know that the iron must be some Roman hangover, and then what's the clay? There are many, many different ideas. I'm not going to get into that today because I think that could take another half an hour, but I just want to talk about what the feet and the toes represent. So the criteria we're looking for to work out what the feet and the toes would be is obviously we're looking for something that's partly made up of the Roman Empire, so we get the iron, and as I said, we're looking for something that is dominant until the millennium. So obviously we're not there yet. So if you think the Western Roman Empire fell in about 476 AD, the eastern half of the Roman Empire continued through the Byzantium until about 1456, I believe, somewhere around then, in which case it got conquered by the Ottomans. So many people argue that the Roman Empire continued in the east. I would have a different point of view. I would say that when the western half of the Roman Empire fell, it merged into the Catholic Church, and there you get the mixing of the iron and the clay and the dominance of the Catholic Church, you know, since the 5th and 6th century has expanded and is, again, now the most dominant religion in the world. There also are many other theories you can get into. You know, the toes, you could say that's 10 toes. That's the 10 regions that broke away from the western half of the Roman Empire when it fell in 476. But again, don't have time to get into that today. But either way, we know that there is some Roman element to the feet and the toes. So whatever view is taken, you can at least see that there is a Catholic connection there, at the very least. There's a Roman element in that final kingdom, a hangover from the Roman Empire, and obviously we're going to see how this all shifted in the 4th century. So why is this significant? So obviously the old Babylon represents the Babylonian Empire, whereas this new Babylon, this mystery Babylon, in my opinion, represents Rome. This should hopefully outline the link between the paganism of Babylon and the current Roman Catholic Church. This becomes really, really important when we're then going to look at the error that's in the church, because there's probably a lot of things that modern-day church does which has its roots in the Catholic Church, which is I'm making the case that this has its roots in Babylon, hence the importance there. So we see the progression of idolatry. Again, so it moves from Babylon into pagan Rome, into the Christian Rome, and then the Catholic Church from there. Now, put this image up here because this is quite important. We see this isn't only a physical map of where things have moved. This is actually where the center of religion, or this mystery religion, has been moved. It starts in Babylon, Pergamus, and Rome. It's really, really important when we look at the next part. I'm going to go through the letter to the church at Pergamus, because it is more than just a physical place in the sense of more than just it represents. Pergamus is not only a physical place that is represented with the religious center that is there, but it also represents the movement of this mystery religion. So it represents a time period in which the church took on this mystery religion, but it also physically. So we're going to see in a minute, when I explain it a bit further, how the priests at Babylon, when that got conquered by Persia, they moved to Pergamus. So there's not only a physical movement, but there's also, I suppose, a spiritual movement when we talk about that time period of Pergamus, which then moved on to Rome, which we'll see representing the letter to the church at Thyatira, which comes after Pergamus. If it sounds complicated, don't worry, we're going to get into it in the next part. So to summarize this part, we can see the progression of idolatry, obviously originating in Babylon and into pagan Rome and into the Catholic Church. As I said, the Catholic Church, this isn't just a misguided church with genuine believers in my opinion, but is the face of idolatry and opposition to God in the world. We're going to see how Pergamus represents the time period during that change. So if you understand about the changes that Constantine made in the 4th century, we're going to see that Pergamus represents this. And then we're going to get into some of the changes that were made. And this has led to the error we see today in the church. So we're going to get into that in the next part. So, okay. We'll get going with the second part. This is going to be the controversial bit. This is probably where people, you're going to throw things at me at the end and things like that. So, here goes. Okay. So, for the second part, if Rome is Mystery Babylon, then obviously at some point the church was infiltrated by Babylonian paganism, since obviously really the first established church was during that time when there was massive compromise, when there was massive mixing of the church with the world, which is born today through the Catholic Church. And this happened during the time period of Pergamus. I'm going to be talking about two major doctrines that are spoken about in the letter to the church of Pergamus, which is the doctrine of Balaam and the doctrine of Nicolaitans. And I'm going to give two examples about how the church still adopts these doctrines today. The first one is going to be Christmas. I'm going to talk about that, the origins of that. And the second one is going to be pastor-led churches. I felt particularly led to do those two topics in particular, since there are many other things, and I'm going to touch on them about how exactly they came to be in this period of time and how they represent particularly the doctrine of Balaam, but I felt very led just to focus on these two in particular. So to do this, I need to explain, obviously, how the letter to the Church of Pergamus represents the time period between the years 313 AD and 590 AD. Particularly, we say those two, it is those two dates because it's in 313 when officially, I guess, the reign of Diocletian ended, and we had Constantine rule over the western half of the Roman Empire. He eventually solidified power, I think in 324 AD, of the whole Roman Empire. But by 313 AD, the persecution of the Christians, had almost pretty much finished, and which we see that with the letter to the church at Smyrna. And by 590, officially, I believe that's the date when you had the first official pope as such. You'd had bishops of Rome, but you had the pope take control of all the churches established. That's when you see what we'd understand to be the Catholic Church. So I want to show how during this time period, Rome mixed Babylonian paganisms with Christianity. Obviously, that's where the infiltration comes from. Then obviously I'll have to demonstrate the error that churches today adopt that are rooted in this paganism. So first I'll go through, obviously, the 7 letters of Revelation 2 and 3, a bit of context there. It's generally believed that the 7 letters in Revelation 2 and 3 have 4 main applications. So you have the local application, so the church that is written to is addressed, obviously, to that church. They did exist. Admonitory, so this applies to all churches. So particularly at the start of the letter, I believe in Revelation it talks about this idea, to the churches. It talks about, obviously, being many churches. So there's a personal application, so it applies to all of us, in the sense of there are most likely today churches that can take from those, I'll say every church probably has something that relates to these 7 churches. Everyone wants to claim to be Philadelphia, which is the faithful church, but obviously not all of them are or can be. And then prophetic, so it provides a prophetic timeline of church history. So this is the controversial point. I've talked about this, I believe, a couple of other times when I've done some Hepzibah talks. And it's what I'm going to be doing next year. I'll work through probably about an 8-part series, going into them, talking about how it represents this timeline into much more detail. So like I say, for this argument, we've got to focus on this application. Obviously, there are many reasons for this. So like I say, these churches represent a timeline of church history. So we're talking about, at the time John wrote it, all the way to the return of Christ. If there were any other order this wouldn't work. So at the time of John writing Revelation, so he wrote it around 95 AD, there would have been maybe close to 100 churches already established. But you've got to ask the question, why did John, or Jesus wrote to them, but why were these 7 churches picked out, and why were they in that order, and why do the issues or the events that happen in those letters relate in order to church history? It's too coincidental, in my belief. We also view Revelation as obviously a book that happens in chronological order. And from Revelation 4, we see the church in heaven. Revelation 6, we see the tribulation, etc. So we've got to think of chapters 2 and 3. You think Revelation 1 is when John sees his vision. Something happens in Revelation 2 and 3 before we get to Revelation 4, where the church are in heaven and the tribulation has started. So we've got to think Revelation 2 and 3 is that in-between period. We also have these terms used in the letter. So he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So again, this idea, he that has an ear is often referenced to something prophetic. You see he who has an ear also in Matthew 13, when Jesus describes the mystery church to come, or the church age to come. And we see it here in Revelation towards the end of each of these letters. You also have he who overcomes, and I'll get into the significance of that in the next part. So this gives somewhat of a universal context to the letters written at the time. And something really important noted, something that's really interesting. In the first 3 churches, this term, he who has an ear, which is obviously asking if you have ears, you're asked to listen to that. He who has an ear comes before he who overcomes. We then have, in the last 4 churches, we have he who has an ear comes after he who overcomes. Many theologians, when they look at that, they go, oh, I just don't know why that happens. But that's because they're not taking Revelation 2 and 3 as a timeline of church history. If you do take that view, it makes a lot more sense why that is the case. And it almost suggests that the first 3 churches, it's like the majority of readers of Revelation, those 3 church ages would have already finished. Because he who has an ear is asking you to really take on board, really listen to what is happening. Now, he who overcomes comes after that. It's almost like that applies to people at that time, but it has no prophetic element to it. Whereas if he who overcomes if he who has an ear comes after he who overcomes, then it's almost like that the entire section, that entire letter, has a prophetic element to it. If that makes sense. If you don't understand, I don't dwell on it too much. But the key instance, the really important thing to note here is obviously the first 3 churches, when we look at the timeline, those 3 churches don't exist as such, and the final 4 churches will exist. You're going to see this in the diagram I have in the next slide. But the final 4 churches are still about to this day, and this is backed up by the references to the end times in those churches. So if you're aware about the letters, you'll be well aware of this concept. So you've got a timeline here, and as you can see, so the church, so if they represent these church ages, as I believe they do, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum are effectively finished. They don't reach the end times, whereas Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea do. Hence why he who has an ear comes at the end of the letter, if you understand what I mean. But that's just more evidence. That is a timeline. And what you have from these, just very briefly, is the Ephesus represents the Apostolic Church, which finished at about 100 AD. Smyrna, the persecuted church, so Christians went through a couple of 100 years of persecution, very, very badly. This ended with Pergamus, which is again where you see this mixing, this compromising of the church begin. And then you have these last 4 churches, which are still about today. You have Thyatira, which represents the Catholic Church. That dominant church age ended at the Reformation, because it was obviously dominant till the Reformation. I suppose it is in a sense today, but these are, in my opinion, these are the dominant movements that happened in those time periods. And obviously, the Reformation started in 1517, and many estimate, obviously, this next church age ended in 1750. You have Philadelphia, so the true church. There are many different views on what these last two churches are, because the theory was popularized around 1900, where they were unsure of what the last two churches meant. But many take this to mean true believers, maybe missionary church, or even churches that have a good understanding of Israel. And then the final church, Laodicea, so maybe an apostate or hyper-charismatic church. That probably resonates in the age that we're in, given the general lukewarmness of Christians that we see. So we're going to be focusing on Pergamos, so the compromising church. And obviously this is what I've talked about, where this is where the pagan infiltration began. What Satan couldn't achieve with persecution, which happened during the time period of Smyrna, he attempted with corruption and infiltration. And Pergamos is followed by Thyatira. And this is really, really important to understand. Obviously, Thyatira represents this Catholic Church age, in which the Catholic Church became very dominant. And it was really fascinating, obviously, Thyatira, before it got changed in, I can't remember, about 250 BC, I believe, it was called Semiramis, which is really, really fascinating, because Thyatira, I believe, was named, it got changed to Thyatira because the leader at the time, who ruled over that city, he named it after his daughter. So Thyatira is often associated with daughter or something like that. But the fact it used to mean Semiramis, which is obviously where you get that Babylonian paganism from, gives clear indications of the link between the Babylonian paganism and the Catholic Church. Since when we actually look at the letter, we're going to see the name is is key to understanding the time period. You know, out of all those churches selected in Revelation 2 and 3, those 7 were chosen for direct purposes. And we see in Revelation 2, 18 to 29, during the church age of Thyatira, that you had Jezebel has seduced them to commit sexual immorality. And those who don't repent of adultery they've committed with her will be cast into the Great Tribulation. Again, side topic, I'd say that if they do repent, then they won't go through the tribulation, which gives a pretty strong pre-tribulation argument, pre-tribulational rapture argument. But the key point being here that Jezebel, remember, Jezebel, woman, we can relate that very heavily to the great harlot in Revelation 17, who caused the world to commit fornication or sexual immorality. In the same way, this Jezebel has convinced the church to commit sexual immorality, which is that Babylonian root of paganism. And this is the result of the changes that happened during the time period of Pergamos. So what we see in Thyatira in the Catholic Church happens because of what happened during 313 and 590 AD. So, what happened during this period? Obviously, I've said there, 313 to 590 AD. We saw the end of Christian persecution, which would have been represented by that time period of Smyrna. Christianity eventually became the official religion in Rome, which that was, I believe, in 380 AD, which, if you think, in 65 to 70 years, Christianity went from being somewhat of a small faith, they estimate maybe 1% of the Roman world were Christians at that time, to all of a sudden, 65, 70 years later, becoming the dominant religion in Rome, the state religion. It's quite remarkable, obviously, how that happened. And during this time, we see formerly pagan traditions and festivals adopted as Christian. So we're going to see in a minute, Constantine, to cement his power, to make himself more popular, wanted to, I suppose, gain popularity with the population. Obviously, his conversion to Christianity, he wanted to make this very easy for people to take in, make them easy to control. So all he did was take their former pagan religious festivals and traditions and just say, okay, well, these are Christian now. And we also see this with pagan priests and ornaments adopted as Christians. So the pagan priests didn't lose their job; they just carried on in a different religion. That was a common circumstance. We've got some edicts and councils here. These are some very, very important landmarks in church history. So the Edict of Milan, saw freedom of all religions to worship without persecution. It's the first time we've seen this in the Roman Empire. We see the Edict of Constantine. So this is when Sunday was changed to the day of rest. I'll talk a little bit about that. But obviously, from what we understand of early church history, since much of the early church was Jewish, they kept to a Saturday Sabbath. Sunday was the day of rest for other reasons, actually for pagan reasons, that Sunday was a day of rest. It was Constantine who made that adjustment to satisfy those pagans in the empire. We see the first counts of Nicaea, so 325. This is where Constantine particularly established what Christian doctrine was, and that, in effect, determined who were heretics. If you disagreed with the Council of Nicaea, you are deemed a heretic. And part of the Council of Nicaea that many theologians often overlook was the fact that Easter was observed to replace Passover. So many of the early church are very unhappy by the fact that the early Christians were observing Passover, so they purposely made the festival of Easter to avoid Passover. And the reason, obviously, for the dates of Easter are purposely to avoid Passover. And you can go into the whole history of Easter, but I won't this talk. You have the Edict of Laodicea, and this is where obviously Christians were no longer to observe the Jewish Sabbath, and the Sabbath was then changed to a Sunday. So again, the early church were not particularly happy that many Christians were observing a Saturday Sabbath, so they changed it to a Sunday. And those who did worship or observe the Sabbath on a Saturday were often excommunicated or faced various bits of persecution, etc. We then have the Edict of Thessalonica, and this is where Christianity was made the state religion in the Roman Empire under Theodosius I. So Constantine had died by this point, but the reforms he instituted carried on. So Constantine didn't actually make Christianity the state religion. He just made he undid the edicts of Diocletian, which brought persecution into the Roman Empire. He removed those and promoted Christianity, and then later it became the state religion. So to understand this period, you have to have a really good understanding of Emperor Constantine. So he was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and this was probably the biggest change we'd seen in the Roman Empire until that point. When Constantine took power, the Roman Empire was ruled by a tetrarchy, so it's a rule of four. We've got a map there, I hope you can see that, but in the top left were Britain and Gaul. Constantius, that was Constantine's father, he died, and Constantine took over Great Britain and Gaul. I believe he was crowned the emperor of that region, or the Augustus or Caesar of that region, I believe in York, actually. And from there were, so a series of civil wars broke out after Constantius' death. Civil wars are quite common in the Roman Empire, and during this time period, if someone died, there was never a clear indication of who would take over. And if someone took over of one of those regions, someone took over, and another one wasn't happy, they would just go to war with them. That was quite a common thing to do. A series of civil wars broke out, and Constantine fought Maxentius over claims of the western half of the Roman Empire. He finally had his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. So I imagine a lot of you are quite familiar with this battle, because this was the key moment in Constantine's conversion. The reason is because before the battle, obviously Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer." The sign then, this is how the story goes, it's very difficult to verify, but supposedly the sign of the cross was then painted on the shields of his army. Other accounts say he had a dream where he fought under the battle of the protection of the god. Obviously they knew him as the Christian god, because Constantine was brought up as a Roman pagan. And he actually had pagan visions in his youth. So this is very peculiar. Anyway, that day, Constantine won a decisive victory, and that's cemented his grip on the western half of the Roman Empire. He eventually took control over the whole empire in 324 after defeating Linicius at the Battle of Chrysopolis. So, And obviously Constantine made a series of massive reforms. He started to adjudicate various councils. So we saw previously the Council of Nicaea in 325. That was actually something that Constantine, he arranged it and oversaw it, which made him de facto the head of the church. So we can probably already think about a figure that is the head of the Catholic Church, who this is almost like a forerunner for, as such. And he was actually the one that would determine many of these decisions on various like error or heresies. Like you have Donatism. So just very briefly, that was the idea that those priests who had effectively surrendered their faith during the persecution, they'd recanted their faith, they were basically told that, okay, well, the sacraments or the things that you did, like the baptism, they now don't count because you recanted your faith. There was a big controversy, and Constantine was asked to basically adjudicate that, to see that through. And particularly, like I say, with the Council of Nicaea, Constantine had a big part to play in the statement of Christian faith, where he obviously set the date for Easter and various church regulations at this council. So we're already seeing, obviously, this is a man who converted to Christianity in order to cement power, having massive control in the changes that the church did and their decision-making on even doctrine. He saw the rise of Christianity as obviously a good opportunity to gain power. This is quite common with Roman emperors. You see with Aurelius, maybe 50 years prior, he really pushed sun worship of Sol Invictus. We're going to see that name in a minute. But often Roman emperors, when they came into power, they'd look to take hold of like the religious power as such, and look to, again, they could cement their power that way. So Constantine started to mix pagan and Christian festivals and traditions. For example, the rest on a Sunday. Sunday was the day for Sol Invictus, the pagans that worship the sun gods to them, they would observe that on a Sunday. So Constantine thought, okay, that's quite a good opportunity to mix the two things together. And then Sunday became the public holiday in the Roman Empire. And obviously he moved the Christian, they wanted to keep it away from the Sabbath on a Saturday, move it to a Sunday. And remember, when we're thinking about the sun god, the original sun god, we should remember is Tammuz, who has also been known as Baal, who in the Roman form is Sol Invictus. So hopefully that sort of makes things very clear. So when residing over ecumenical councils, he cared very little of the dispute, and rather he would just make decisions to resolve the disagreements for the most number of people. So he wasn't very interested in doctrine particularly. Constantine didn't live a very Christian life. He had his brother-in-law murdered. He had his wife and his son, his second wife and son also murdered because he believed they had an affair or something like that. So there are many things he did very unchristian, and he's the man who is resolving these disagreements. And again, these reforms continued even after his death in 337 AD. And then eventually some back and forward between Christian and pagan Roman emperors. We eventually see Theodosius. Under Theodosius, Christianity became a state religion in 380 AD. And this is what's described in the letter to the church at Pergamos. Okay, so hopefully that's given a good understanding of what's happened in that time period. So we're going to have a look at the letter of Pergamos. We're going to walk through it, identify some key ideas. So some context of Pergamos. It's a city in what we know as modern-day Turkey. It's known as Asia at the time of John's writing as part of the Roman Empire. And Pergamos was a religious center in the Roman Empire. As I mentioned earlier, when Persia invaded Babylon, the priests moved from Babylon to Pergamos and put their religious, their icons, traditions, and brought that with them into Pergamos. And obviously, this is something that actually influenced the religion in Rome. And we're going to walk through that because, again, this is significant to what we understand during the time period of Pergamos, the mixing of this Babylonian religion into what we understand as the Catholic Church. So, like I say, we'll walk through it. I'll just read through it and then we'll dissect it as we go. So Revelation 2, verse 12. And the angel to the church in Pergamos writes, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Thus you also have those things who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. So we'll slowly walk through what was said there. So, and to the angel of the church in Pergamos write. So, looking at the name of Pergamos, so we understand this to, if you break down the two words, and there's a Greek meaning as such, you have per, which means mixed or questionable, and then gamos, meaning marriage. So gamos relates to marriage. So the term means as a whole, if you break down the two Greek words, the term means mixed or objectionable marriage. And this represents the church marrying into the world. So that's that mixed or questionable marriage, church adopting many of the beliefs of the world. Like I say, as mentioned, it was a religious centre in the Roman Empire. It had the symbol of the Caestus, the symbol of the city. So that medical symbol we see of a serpent. See in this image here, we'll flick to it in a minute. But that was the symbol of the city. And obviously this originates in Numbers 21, verse 8 and 9, with the bronze serpent. So then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. It shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. Obviously you see it there, the picture on the left being of Moses with the serpent. And obviously this is really indicative of Pergamos as a whole, because what was something that was good from Numbers that actually healed the people that looked at it. By the time in the books of Kings, the Israelites actually start to worship the bronze serpent in the reign of Hezekiah. So something that was there, that was good from the Torah, from the old the books of Moses, is then being abused later. And actually Hezekiah had to remove the bronze serpent. So it says here in 2 Kings 18, 3 and 4, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image and broke its pieces. The bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Hashatan. This is really important because when we're going to look at some of the compromises made by the church, many of the excuse is often, oh, well, we're taking something pagan and making it Christianized or making it good. That's taking something bad and making it good. But the whole point of Pergamos is that you've taken something that was good in the books of Moses, and the Israelites start to worship it, and they start to use it for the wrong purposes, and that has displeased the Lord. It's really worth knowing that when we later get into some of the compromises that started during that period, it's not something we should take very lightly or something we should be engaging in. So we'll carry on. So, obviously, Pergamos represents the mixing of the church with the world. We see this with the name and the symbol of the city. And we see, obviously, Christian things that end up being paganized and pagan things that are made Christian. So we see that mixing of something that shouldn't be happening. That's the objectionable marriage which is happening during that time. And this is where this pagan infiltration began in the church. And also in verse 12, so we see this sharp two-edged sword. So each of the letters, if you've looked through them in Revelation, there's always a title for Jesus, and this is the title. And often a two-edged sword will represent the word of God. We see this in Hebrews 4:12. And often the title for Jesus is often the remedy of what the issues are. So if there's an issue there, the remedy here is the word of God, because often as well it's where people start to stray away from the word. And obviously you look at the modern day Catholic Church today, it's not even something they value particularly. Then it gets ramped up really. So see in verse 13, obviously, I know your works, where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And this is really, not pulling any punches. So obviously the church has been infiltrated by paganism to the extent where Satan now has his throne there. And that's quite a serious thing. It's not just that it's a little bit messed up. Satan literally lives there, right? And actually we see this image portrayed when we look at Matthew 13, which is probably the most misunderstood parable when we look at the parable I'm going to talk about, relating to, Satan's throne. So Matthew 13, 31 to 32 is a parable of the mustard seed. Many people interpret this as, well, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and then obviously it grows, greater than the herbs, becomes a tree. Oh, so the kingdom of heaven is great because it starts really small and it grows and grows and gets really, really big, and that's all great and fantastic. But that misses a few key elements. And we see them in verse 32 in Matthew 13. But when it is grown, so this is talking about the mustard seed, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree. So obviously this is talking about the church expanding at a rapid rate. And it's during this time period of Pergamos that the church expanded and grew to, as I say, to less than 1% of the Roman Empire, to the point where it is the state religion. And then this is where the troubling part comes in. So it grows so big, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. Now, if you look back in Matthew 13, and you look at the parable of the sower, the birds in the parable of the sower are described as the wicked one. You can see that in Matthew 13, 4 and 19. So really the parable of the mustard seed is a parable of how the church grows and grows and grows, and to the point where now the wicked one, who obviously is Satan, and those who work for Satan, are now nesting in its branches. The church has grown so big, and during that time period of Pergamos, people who definitely were not saved, who were not Christians, who had pagan history, were being made priests. They were in charge of churches. And that really cements the infiltration that Satan had in that time. So when I go into the series next year, we'll see how the 7 parables in Matthew 13 link very, very closely to the 7 letters in Revelation. That's for another day. So, so we can clearly see that, hopefully. The next key point is when we're going to get into the 2 doctrines now. This is where it'll get very offensive for a lot of people. So, obviously, but I have a few things against you. So, in all the letters, generally, bar a couple, there are things which Jesus has against these churches. And one of these is that they hold to the doctrine of Balaam. He taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So during this time, we see the doctrine of Balaam. I'm sure you can already think about the things that may have happened. But we'll just explore what this doctrine of Balaam is. So a little bit about Balaam. So he was a prophet. We find him in the book of Numbers. And if you remember the story from Numbers, he was hired by the king of the Moabites, which is Balak. And he was asked by Balak, obviously, to curse Israel. He refused to curse Israel. However, Balaam taught Balak how to destroy Israel, what they needed to do. So he didn't curse them, but he gave him some pretty good advice on what to do to effectively destroy them. And this was basically to get the Moabites to seduce the Israelites into marrying them. And this was directly forbidden in the Torah. So the doctrine of Balaam represents effectively the method of corrupting God's people, of getting them to engage in what God does not want them to do. And we see this actually in a New Testament context a couple of times, a couple of verses. So in 2 Peter 2:15, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. And in Jude 11, woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. They run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perish in the rebellion of Korah. So when we think about the doctrine of Balaam, what that means, it is obviously false teaching or getting people, Christians or God's people, in a way to get themselves involved in idolatry, to get themselves involved in that fornication as such. And this obviously represents the church being led astray by those who have infiltrated the church. And again, this is what happened during this period of Pergamos. Now, this is where it gets quite difficult. So, compromising church. So, obviously, this is called the compromising church. Now, there are many traditions that were implemented by Constantine that are of pagan origin. Obviously, this is that mixing that's going on. This is the doctrine of Balaam. So, a few things that might be very surprising to you. So, like I say, Sunday Sabbath, many people refer to it as the Lord's Day. The only time the Lord's Day is really referenced is in Revelation 1, I believe, and that's not in reference to Sunday. That is in reference to the day of the Lord, which is to come. Sunday is originally a day to honour the Sol Invictus. Like I say, the very, very early church, it wasn't their day of worship, it was always the Sabbath, which was the Saturday. But Paul talks a lot about, a day is to one as it is to another. It doesn't really matter what day you worship on, but this rigid idea of you have to keep to Sunday, you have to rest on a Sunday, it comes from here. It comes from the honouring of Sol Invictus, from that public holiday during the 4th century in the Roman Empire. We have Easter, which comes from Ishtar, which is the god of fertility in the Babylonian and Assyrian religion. This then extends into Easter, so an Anglo-Saxon goddess, also of fertility, with the symbols of the eggs and bunny rabbits, etc., etc. That's where Easter comes from. Very surprisingly as well, we have the cross symbol. Many people aren't aware of this. If you read the book I referenced at the start, Babylon the Mysteries, by Woodrow, he goes into all the different types of things that Christians do that are of pagan origin. He does a whole chapter on the cross symbol. We actually see symbols of the cross used well before obviously Jesus died on the cross, etc. And the very, very early church never really used it as a sign, because many people will have the sign of the cross, but the whole idea of Christianity is obviously that he's risen. The sign of a cross was originally used as a worship of Tammuz, and you see it if you look at a lot of Egyptian art and things like that. But like I say, feel free to look into these. I'm going to really highlight one particular festival. And this one's going to be Christmas. That makes a lot of sense given the time of year that we are in. And in my view, as part of this doctrine of Balaam, is one of the biggest compromises the church makes today, and that is to celebrate Christmas. So I'm going to go into the origins of it. I'm going to give an example of this doctrine of Balaam, which has caused Christians to partake in idolatry. So I'll give a little rundown of the history of Christmas. So officially, it was first celebrated on the 25th of December, 336 AD. Hopefully you remember why it's the 25th of December, but I will cover that. Again, this is during the Pergamos age. And this is one of the major holidays in the Roman Catholic calendar. They have 5 major holidays. Christmas is one of them. And you're going to get into the reasons why in a minute. So it has direct roots to Babylon. It's another way in which the church has been led astray. So it was originally celebrated long time before the Roman Empire, in honour of the birth of Tammuz. Remember the story we talked at the beginning? Tammuz being the son of Semiramis, the Babylonian queen of heaven. And this is celebrated on the 25th of December. Tammuz is also referred to as Baal, the sun god. So when you see in the Old Testament where the Israelites were going after Baal, and they were putting, it talks a lot about an evergreen tree, putting that up for Baal. We're talking about the same person as Tammuz, so it's just simply that particular region's version of Tammuz. And obviously these celebrations included, so hymn singing, merrymaking, feasting, drunkenness, giving of gifts, etc. These are all things that were conducted on the 25th of December in honour of the birth of Tammuz. We also see, as part of worship to Tammuz, involved the cutting down of an evergreen tree, decorating it and placing gifts underneath. Remember the story I talked about at the beginning? The tree growing from a stump represented Tammuz being reborn as Nimrod, the sun god. And we actually see this observance in Jeremiah 10. So Jeremiah 10, 2-5, this is quite the common verse cited when we're looking at this particular issue. So you can see in verse 3, one cuts a tree from the forest, they decorate it with gold and silver. And this is obviously what the Gentiles did in that region to Baal, the sun god, initially being Tammuz. So you can kind of see a side-by-side comparison here. This is obviously, on the right, what theirs look like, and obviously on the left, the Christmas trees that obviously Christians put in their houses during that time of the year. And it's really important to see that this displeases the Lord. You can see this from 2 Kings 16. So you can see here, he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord. He sacrificed and burnt incense on the high place in the hills under every green tree. So we see a very common theme of evergreen trees in the Bible. I've got a list of verses there. You can go and have a look if you want. And the really key point is that whenever Israel involved themselves in those practices of the pagans with these evergreen trees, which wasn't in honor of Baal, it massively displeased the Lord, and Israel very often faced repercussions for that. And again, this is part of the worship of Baal or Tammuz. And obviously this made its way into the pagan Roman Empire. Remember what I was talking about, how Babylon has moved to pagan Rome, so then to the Catholic Church. Baal, like I say, was the sun god of the Babylonian religion. So the Romans just literally took that idea and applied it to Sol Invictus, who was their sun god. And it's during the festival of Saturnalia, celebrated as the victory of Sol Invictus over the darkness of the winter solstice. So very often you'd have quite a long period and a run-up, I suppose like we do in this country. Pretty much as soon as Halloween is over, the Christmas adverts come out and everything like that, and starts to think about Christmas. It was a long run-up to the 25th of December, which the Romans, obviously, they use as Sol Invictus, the celebration honouring of him, but originally was that of Tammuz. Obviously, yeah, that's where it comes from. As I said there, yeah. Now, when the Roman Empire became Christian, and again, part of Constantine's mixing of Christianity with paganism, and part of the Pergamus, part of the mixed marriage, the objectionable marriage, they took the festival of Saturnalia and just applied it to Jesus instead. So rather than Tammuz or Baal or Sol Invictus being born on the 25th of December, it was Jesus instead. That's how it applied. Again, if you read the two Babylons, Hislop gets into why it was inconceivable that Jesus would have been born on the 25th of December. Again, I don't really have time to get into today, but that's why we have the date, that's why we have what we do, and I'm going to get into some of the features in a minute. And also we see with Semiramis and Tammuz, like I sort of talked about earlier, they eventually become Mary and Jesus. We're going to have a look in a minute, particularly with the Nativity. So here's a good example. The halo around them was often imagery of deities. We see Mary, we see Jesus, Again, this goes back to this mother and child worship, Mary and Jesus, or whether it was Venus and Cupid, whatever it's been, it's just continued, and you put a Christian over this ultimately pagan idea. So, key to understanding the pagan roots of Christmas was obviously you've got to understand that there is this passing on of traditions. I hope it's been very, very clear. I've sort of gone over this already. But obviously this Rome is just a repackaged version of Babylon. And through Christmas, obviously Christians today, by bringing in a Christmas tree, by doing the things that were observed by the pagan Romans, or the Babylonians, or all these things, whether we like it or not, and whether we'd care to admit, but it is part of this Tammuz worship that would have been done, that God would have condemned the Israelites for, that I think is displeasing to God. And many of these forms of Tammuz worship we see Christians do today. So you have the Yule log that was often lit the night before. The Yule log would represent Nimrod's death as a sort of dead tree. And then the Christmas tree on the next day would represent Nimrod's resurrection in Tammuz. So that was the whole point of the Yule log being on the day before, being lit, and the Christmas tree being there on the day after. We have the 12 days of Christmas, obviously the feasting and overindulging. Christmas caroling, even. Originally, there were songs to drive away evil. We have Christmas wreaths, holly and mistletoe, candles being lit, giving of gifts, Father Christmas and Santa. Because we've got to remember, we don't really see many of these sorts of things in the Bible. And if we do, they're not in a good way. But this is why, obviously, today we see it ingrained in our culture and done by non-Christians, and Christians, by the way. But there's an overall acceptance of this festival by unbelievers. So it should really get us questioning. And we also see Christmas, also, like I was saying earlier, involves partaking in mother and child worship. And we particularly see this in the nativity scene, as I mentioned. So there you have Mary and Jesus, again with these symbols of deity, with typically in most of art. But as I mentioned earlier, this is something that we see all around the world, and it's highlighted in the nativity. I would say to a lot of people, when you're looking at a nativity scene, you're not looking at Mary and Jesus, because most likely a lot of what actually happened there didn't happen. We talk about 3 wise men. They didn't turn up most likely until Jesus was not a child, not a baby anymore, when he was maybe an infant or child, we're unsure. But that scene in the nativity, you're not seeing Mary and Jesus, you're seeing Semiramis and Tammuz. That's what's actually being portrayed there. And we see this in multiple religions. And the really important point that we should be asking as Christians is, why is Christmas so widely received by the world, despite Jesus and Christianity generally being hated by the world, being despised by the world? Again, it's because this is obviously the root of paganism. This is rooted in paganism, and it's part of that compromise which occurred at Pergamus. So the doctrine of Balaam was obviously partaking of the idolatry that God instructs his people not to do. I've used one example of Christmas as Christians partaking in the worship of Tammuz, Baal. Remember, when we think about the letter written to Pergamus, that's the thing that Jesus held against them, is that they took part in that doctrine of Balaam. They got involved in idolatry that they were not supposed to get involved in, and started to mix the pagan and Christian traditions. We see Israel fall for this many times in the Old Testament. And actually, we get instructed by Paul. If we look at 1 Corinthians 10, I won't read through it, but just to give some context if you want to look at it later, if you want the slides or watch the video. But something that's really key in 1 Corinthians 10:21 to highlight, Paul actually gives the context beforehand about the Israelites and their idolatry that they involved themselves in. That's the topic he's addressing. He says, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So like I say, when we look at the first 13 verses in 1 Corinthians 10, It's talking about the idolatry that Israel partook in the Old Testament. And much of this was the worship of Baal. We see that time and time and time again. And Paul is telling us that as Christians, we can't engage in those things. And it's my belief, again, that this is what Christians are doing when we celebrate Christmas, when we do these other things. And this is part of the doctrine of Balaam. I'll just give a moment to ponder that. So, the last point I'm going to go on to is this doctrine of the Nicolaitans. This is really the next major error that I believe we see in the church. So, they're first mentioned in Revelation 2, verse 6, before we see them in Revelation 2:15. But this you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. I'll get into exactly what the word means, what exactly this doctrine is. It's interesting to note is there's no historical consensus on who they were. The church history, we don't know. People have theories. They have theories that maybe there's a guy called Nicholas or who had doctrines enticing the church to eat things sacrificed to idols. There's no really evidence that group ever existed or that he existed at all. And what's really important, we'll get into especially later, is that the Ephesian church hated this doctrine, but the church at Pergamos held to this doctrine. And when I explain what this doctrine is, it'll make a lot of sense when we look at the comparison. So I'm going to explain what this doctrine of the Nicolaitans is, and I'll explain sort of the origin, and then I'm going to explain the modern day application by this. Again, this is another issue that's very controversial. I'm not particularly liked over it. But we're going to look at this whole pastor issue and the biblical governance of a church and how it should be run. So, what is this doctrine? We can't really pinpoint the error they adopted as such. Many people have their theories, but many theologians that I side with, that I agree with, say the evidence of the error is suggested from the terms that it comes from. Now, Nicolaitans comes from two terms. You break the word up. So, Nikau means to conquer, Laos, which is laity, which suggests that this refers to a priestly order or clergy, which makes a lot of sense given what happened during the time period, because Christianity became effectively state-sponsored. Even under Constantine, priests would get special privileges, and we're going to see further how this sort of developed. And many people take this to refer to those who claim to have apostolic authority, which if you know about, say, the Catholic Church or anything like that, they refer to church fathers, who then they say that they refer to apostolic authority. The idea of a pope is an unbroken chain from Peter, supposedly to Catholics, despite the error in that. It's totally unbiblical, totally wrong, but that's what Catholics claim, and that's obviously part of the doctrine that they hold to. Now, I take this to be an unbiblical approach as church leadership. So this is really interesting because not only do festivals and traditions have pagan roots, but also church leadership and governance that we see today in most churches also has this sort of pagan root to it. We see this today. So this idea of a priesthood and clergy originates and is taken from pagan religious orders. And we're going to see, obviously, how one-man leadership became mainstream in this period. Or we won't see, but it was the case that one-man leadership of a church became mainstream during this period of church history. And I'm going to present anyway how that's not really how the apostles conducted church governance. But the major beginning, obviously, of his clerical order starts with the Pontifex Maximus. Those who know your Latin might have a better understanding of what the word means. But the term Pontifex Maximus, so this is the title held by the high priest in the Roman religion. So obviously when Rome went from a Babylonian paganism and then to Roman paganism, they took their ideas with them. And then when pagan Rome became Christian Rome, they just took the same system with them. So you have this Pontifex Maximus, the very guy at the top, who is in charge of the religious system. Julius Caesar took over as Roman emperor. He proclaimed himself Pontifex Maximus. Julius Caesar would, he's a very arrogant bloke, but he was effectively the first Pontifex Maximus who was a Roman emperor. And these continued to be the Roman emperors until about 378 AD, when I believe the Roman emperor at the time rejected that title, which somewhat left it vacant, in which case the Bishop of Rome effectively was elected to that position of Pontifex Maximus. So this is where we see like the forerunner for the Pope, because given Rome's status in the world at the time, people, I guess, looked to authority, leadership, guidance from the bishop in Rome. So he became the one, and obviously he would then claim that obviously he took it from the Roman emperors, and that gives him extra authority, etc. And this is where we get the idea of the Catholic Church with the Pope, who is in charge, who is between us and God, for example. We get that idea. And this obviously then led to a clerical system in the church. So we see different levels of structure. See, none of it biblical. Formerly pagan priests elected to important positions in the church. And this mimicked the Babylonian system. And in effect, we see the church structure or system that we have today, which was taken from Babylon. If you look at the Catholic Church, or even the Church of England today, we see that, popes, archbishops, bishops, priests, etc. We see that clerical order, which we don't see in Scripture. So like I say, there was a clergy under the Pontifex Maximus, and these were effectively Christianized positions. So this is where you see a system where under the Pope, you have cardinals. Under cardinals, you have bishops. Under bishops, you have priests. And there are obviously various people in between. But we don't really see these terms in the Bible other than bishop. But I'm going to get into that in a minute. But I say Pope, cardinal are not in there. A bishop is used in the Bible. And it's heavily not only misunderstood, but misapplied in churches today when people talk about bishops. It's totally an error, and I'll explain how. So looking at bishops, many people are of the understanding that a bishop is someone that controls multiple churches. I've even heard someone talk about this quite recently, this idea that a bishop is someone in control of multiple churches, and the pastor is under a bishop who has one church, etc. But this idea of a bishop being in control of multiple churches it comes from the Catholic system in which a bishop is located at a cathedral. And the term cathedral rooted in the word cathedral, which means throne. So typically you have the cathedral of that region, and obviously the bishop is in charge of that region, lots of local parishes or local churches. But that's not a biblical structure. Again, that's just taken from Roman paganism, from Babylon. However, when we look at the Bible, when we see the term bishop in the Bible, we see that the term bishop and elder are the same position in the church. They're used interchangeably. And we'll see that in Titus 1 when we have a look in a minute. I'm going to give in how a church should be led, and we'll see the terms there. But like I say, in a clerical system, you then have priests under a bishop who occupy one church. Priests refer themselves to the bishop, etc. Bishop go higher, and you have that sort of chain of command. And in a church, typically a church with a priest or something like that, these are the sole ministers of the word and are responsible for the congregation. So they're the ones that do everything. They'll often be full-time. That's their job. They perform all the rituals and sacraments for the congregation. So obviously, that's how they understand in Church of England or Catholics. They understand there's rituals and sacraments. And particularly in the Catholic Church, obviously we understand priests are called fathers. Again, which is taken from ancient paganism. We're told in the Bible not to call anyone a father, but the Catholic Church obviously does it because of the pagan roots of that. And the disappointing thing really is that in modern churches today, we see a de facto bishop and priest system. For example, something that we're probably very accustomed to, this idea of denominations with an overall leader who has authority over regional pastors. Any denomination you see will often have a head base somewhere, and obviously it's the pastor who's in charge of the church. They refer themselves to the leader of the denomination, and there's this chain of command which you see, which is again taken from that Catholic system of bishop and priest. If we have a sole pastor in charge of a church who refers himself to the head of the denomination, I don't see any difference to that being a bishop to a priest, personally. Nowhere in the Bible do we see a reference to denomination, the body of Christ. There is no division between that. You don't see satellite churches or controlled church plants where someone sets up a church and they're still under the authority. It's never said in the Bible the church is independent. There isn't this referring again to a head church or a central hub or anything like that. And we don't see one-man-led churches, particularly. I understand if there is one person in charge of a gathering of maybe a handful of people, I understand. But if you're talking a church of 30, 50, 100 people, one man leading that church is an unbiblical model. And again, these are taken from a Catholic model rooted in paganism. So one of the biggest issues, or one of the biggest errors I think we see in terms of church structure is this unbiblical structure. And it can be very, very dangerous, I believe, for many, many reasons. And the reason people like to, I suppose, defer to one man at the top is just our cultural understanding of how churches run and our worldly understanding of how businesses are run. I think things like that. People take their businesses, how they run institutions or anything like that, they take it into the church, where it doesn't really belong. And it comes from a misunderstanding of Scripture. And like I've sort of mentioned here, we've effectively taken the role that a pastor will have in a church. We've taken that effectively from the Catholic version of what a priest would do. This is where we would have placed the burden of authority onto one man. Very often this man is full-time employed. Nowhere in the Bible does it really suggest one man running a church who is full-time employed. It doesn't happen, isn't said anywhere. And we're going to look into the role of a pastor and how a church should be governed to show you how this is unbiblical. So like I say, many churches have a church, obviously it is pastor-led. They'll often have, or you can get some churches with elders. It's a very odd model. You have pastors and then elders. But when you really get into it, churches with that model of a pastor and an elders just view the elders as assistant pastors that are underneath the pastor as the main guy. Again, this isn't anything biblical. You still have that one man running it. And as when we actually get into the terms, the term pastor is only used once in the Bible. And nowhere in the Bible is the term pastor used for a church position. We only see the term pastor in the English of the particular role as a spiritual gift in Ephesians 4. So when we get into it, so verse 11 here, it says he gave himself some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. It's the only time you see the word pastor being used in the Bible. And there's no authority attached to this position. It doesn't say anywhere here. It doesn't say that there's one pastor in a church either. In theory, pastor is more like, again, related to the word shepherd, which could be like a mentor, for example, something like that. Like I say, so the Greek word is similar to that of shepherd, and he's used in the context of spiritual gifts. So we see earlier in Ephesians, but to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. So again, it's not an official position, it's not an office, but it's in fact a gift. And this is addressed to a body of believers. So this means that every member of the church can possess those gifts. It's not exclusively for this clerical order of people, this special group of people, but can be a gift that is given to anyone in a congregation. And again, they're separate to offices. You only see two offices listed in Scripture. When you look particularly at 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, you see elder and deacon. It's the only ones listed in Scripture, which really opens the door for anyone operating as a pastor in a church without having any authority or even being an elder as such. One of the main counter-arguments I've had, I think is worth going over very briefly, is that this idea that elders are supposed to shepherd the flock. We see this in 1 Peter 5, particularly verse 2, shepherd the flock of God, which is among you, serving as overseers. But the key thing to understand here is that the word shepherd here is in the verb form. So it's not in the noun. So this doesn't describe a position with an official position attached to anything like that. It simply describes an action, like a doing word, what they're supposed to do. The position that actually is addressed to is overseers. As we're going to see in a minute, overseer, bishop, elder are pretty much exclusively all the same term. So in a similar way that elders are told they must have the ability to pastor, or they're told here that they must have the ability to pastor, it also talks about in 1 Timothy 3:2, they must have the ability to teach as a teacher. So elders will shepherd the flock, they will pastor the flock, but one man has this position of pastor in charge of everything, running a church isn't biblical, and we'll see that in a minute. To make the case that all teachers are elders isn't biblical, like the claim that all pastors are elders are biblical. I've heard people walk through the book of Titus and go, oh, elders there, well, that just means senior pastor or something like that. It doesn't indicate from the text whatsoever. And again, like I say, this comes from the Roman Catholic Church. One of the big disappointments of the Reformation was their failure to break this laity congregation, should be laity, clergy, divide, from Rome. It was their failure to do that. The Reformers simply took a Catholic model and applied it. A really good example is when Henry VIII formed the Church of England. He just took all the same positions with him. And they kept this one man leading a church. And as more Protestant denominations formed, they kept the structure of a priest, but they just renamed it to pastor. So you go to any local church, you can go to particularly maybe like a Baptist church or something like that, not to name any names, but you'll see the pastor's in charge, and that's just it. That taking on that role of a priest, similar to Catholic Church. And this man will very often be full-time employed, which I think really hardens this clergy, laity divide, because one person is paid to take on these gifts, take on the authority, and everyone else is not, and they just turn up and get his service as such. And it's just an unbiblical model. And there are various issues, again, with one pastor-led church. We'll go over these. The financial issue is a big issue. Because obviously if you're getting paid as a full-time pastor over a congregation, there can lead to corruption, can lead to compromises having to be made. You may have to generate income, so you may have to compromise on the word or even seek fame, etc. And it just hardens that divide of laity and congregation. Just say laity and clergy, etc. It hardens that divide between who leads a church and who does not. And nowhere in the Bible does it say that. And also it talks about, we'll get into it later in a minute, but the authority of a church governance belongs to an eldership, not one man. And like I say, very often, not in all cases, but you can get pastors that lead churches, they lord authority over the congregation, despite elders being instructed not to. So it talks about in 1 Peter 5:3, nor being as lords over those entrusted to you, with examples of the flock. Part of this will be pastors obviously telling their congregation to submit to authority, which is absolutely right from Hebrews 13:17, although it does say elders, not pastors, but it's true, we should submit to our elders. But we're also told in Ephesians 5:21 to submit to one another, because this idea of church isn't simply to have one man in charge we listen to every week who does everything who takes on all the gifts, etc. It should be something that is divided amongst the body of a congregation. Another key issue would be with error. So if a pastor goes into error and he's the one man running the church, the whole church goes into error. It's a very, very common tale. There's no accountability for the pastor. We're going to see in a minute how the apostles deal with a discussion. You don't just have one man being, this is the way it is because I know the Bible, or this is the way it is because I said so, but is it rather a discussion, and then the congregation has to agree on what's been said. And very often young believers, I've seen this example very recently at a church I've gone to, young believers can often rely on the pastors for their faith and understanding. So if the pastor says something, well, he's right because when I first came here saved, he gave me all the, he changed my life, etc., and all this sort of idea. And this leads to an inability to question what the pastor says. We also have the limiting of gifts, again, what I've sort of talked about. Diversity of gifts should be used throughout the church. We see this in 1 Corinthians 12. However, if you have a full-time pastor at the front, there's someone that takes on these gifts and it limits the exercising of the gifts for the congregation, which should be something in church governance. So if something's so irregular, you should have a regular exercising of gifts by the congregation. And the final massive issue that I have, obviously, is that the only time the term shepherd or pastor is used in a reference to one man is in reference to Jesus. So Jesus is our pastor, Jesus is our shepherd. When the pastor of a church takes on that title, many theologians argue that this is making a comparison to Jesus, and they would argue that that's blasphemous. I might not be so inclined to go that far, but it's a common view said by many theologians. We've got a series of verses on Jesus being our shepherd. I'll just briefly flick through these. We are running out of time slightly. So this sort of reads the question of who does lead a church. You have two official positions, as I spoke about. You have elder and deacon. We see those roles in Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. And many equate the role of elder with pastor with no biblical justification for this. As we'll see, a church is to be run by a group of elders, not just one man. We see three terms, so I think I'm coming to the end. We have three terms in English used to describe who leads a church. We have elder, bishop, and overseer. And the Greek terms for these are presbyteros, and then bishop and overseer is episkopon. And we see this with the apostles. They obviously went and appointed elders. These are the terms used. So in Acts 14:23, elders are appointed, and on Titus 1:5. It's very important to see that obviously these are the people appointed to lead churches, and it's important to note the plural. So it's elders, not one man. And these elders are to be ordained. Pastors are not ordained, and they're very often ordained by other people. They're not ordained. They don't ordain themselves. They don't say, well, I'm the pastor now, I'm in charge. It doesn't happen. And we see how elders and bishops are used interchangeably. We don't have that separation of bishop is over an elder or anything like that. There is one level. You have bishops, elders, overseers. They're the ones who have the authority in a church, but again, it's a different source of authority than you might think. And then, and that's it. There are no assistant pastors. There's no priests or anything like that. Used synonymously here. So when we look at Titus, it says, "Underpoint elders in every city as I command you," and it gives a description of what an elder should be. And then, "For a bishop must be blameless." Again, they're used synonymously. And probably the best example we see in Acts 15 over the system that we should use in a church. In Acts 15, if you work your way through these, we see a disagreement. It's a disagreement over whether Christians need to be circumcised. The apostles and elders meet together to discuss the issue. And then you have the apostles and the elders, again, they all give their view. So Peter gives his view, Barnabas and Paul gives his view, James, Simon. And then this is the key part, really. The apostles, elders, and whole church agree that they're going to send Judas and Silas to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. So because the issue rose in Antioch, so they're going to send these people to deal with that issue in Antioch over this disagreement. And then they write a letter that they take with them, written by the apostles, elders, and the brethren. Again, that's the whole church congregation. So Acts 15 gives a really good, correct version of what church government should be. We don't see one man make the decision on everyone's behalf. But rather today, we see a clerical structure used by churches. And this is the Nicolaitan system. And obviously, this is what happened in the 4th century. This is what is referenced here when the doctrine of Nicolaitanism. And it's really important to see that, obviously, when we remember back from the letter to the church in Ephesus, it was told that they hate the deeds of Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So the apostles were doing church governance correctly. However, by the time we get to Pergamos, they had fully adopted that doctrine. We saw back in Acts 15, obviously, the correct system that the apostles used and the way that they were going about implementing that properly. So to summarize, during this time period of Pergamos, the church became infiltrated, obviously, by paganism, which I've talked about. This continued today with many errors. I focused on 2 today, just Christmas and pastor-led churches. We take both of those from the Catholic Church. And again, the Catholic Church is the face of idolatry in the world. It's my belief, I implore you today, we should be rejecting this idolatry and error. And I think it's really important that we self-reflect on the things that we have done or do. And ultimately, we want to do what's pleasing to God. And so that's why I've highlighted those 2 issues today.